Shalom, and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. I have a special guest who is an Israeli filmmaker. Warm welcome to the program. My guest is all the way from Israel. His name is Igal Hechet. He's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and he's made this amazing film called My Home, which gives an Israeli Arab perspective on Israel and the Middle East. Igal, warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I just got a comment that I really, really enjoyed your film called My Home, that gives an Israeli Arab perspective on Israel and the Middle East. I thought it was groundbreaking. I thought it was incredibly professional, and it told a really compelling story and showed all sides and aspects of Israeli Arab society and their views on the Jewish state.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it was a wonderful film to make. I made it with Leo Cohen here in Israel. I'm a Canadian Israeli filmmaker. Basically, I was born in Israel and we moved to Canada many years ago, and I work from Canada, so it's a Canadian Israeli film, and I just happen to be in Israel now making a film about the elections and other projects. So I'm here right now. My Home was a film I wanted to make for many years. I knew the narrative that everybody hears that Arab Israelis are hate the state of Israel. They view the state of Israel in a certain way, and that's usually the narrative that you always hear, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in North America. And I knew that not to be the case, and so it took a little while to make. And basically, I decided to contact a few people, and they introduced me to people within the Arab Israeli community who are very much pro-Israel, who are very much have issues with certain things that happen here. And much like any other country, and I think it's important to note, the state of Israel does have racism in it. It's not a perfect state. And I always like to point that out. Show me one state that is. As a Canadian, I can tell you that Canada certainly has its share of racism, much more than the state of Israel does. You know, if I look at Europe, the state of Israel doesn't ban burqas. The state of Israel doesn't ban various other things from people of the Muslim faith. And so, you know, when it comes to the state of Israel, it certainly has its share of problems. It certainly has its share of racism, much like any other country. But when it comes to the Arab citizens living in the state of Israel, they are living in a much more comfortable, safer environment than anywhere else in the Middle East. Specifically, let's say in the countries surrounding Israel. Is there more work to do to combat racism, to have them integrate more into society? Absolutely. But is Israel this demon that is that's how it's always presented in the media, be it in the UK or anywhere else? That is a complete false narrative that's being presented to you.
And Igal, before we go on and talk about this excellent film that you've made called My Home, it'd be really interesting to get your family background, because your parents come from Russia. They made Aliyah to Israel.
Right.
You were born in Israel, and then at the age of 11, your family moved to Canada. So you have a pretty kind of unique perspective on Israel. So can you share with us something about your remarkable family background?
Sure. My parents moved to Israel from the Ukraine in 1974, when there was that 2-year period when they allowed the Jews to leave, and they basically allowed them to leave with 2 suitcases. That was the rule. And so they moved to a city called Ashkelon, which is in the southern part of Israel. And then in 1988, they decided to move to Canada. I was born in 77 in Ashkelon. And, you know, Canada is a wonderful country. They thrive there. I've always had a connection to Israel. In 20 years of filmmaking and making television shows, the bulk of my work is here in Israel. I also work across the world. I film movies about genocides in Bangladesh and Cambodia and all over Africa and things along those lines. but I try to at least have one project a year in Israel. I think it's a remarkable country. Obviously, we're speaking. It interests people constantly. For such a tiny spot on the face of the earth, it feels like it's in. When you look at a map, depending on, I guess, how you look at a map, it's almost in the heart of the world. And there's always exciting stories to tell here. I don't ignore. I make it a point not to ignore stories that that present Israel in a negative light. But I also don't make it my career, like many other filmmakers in Israel, Israeli filmmakers and other Israelis, to defame the state of Israel. And so you need to strike that balance, and you need to be as objective as you can when you make a documentary film or series. And I think slowly over the years, I've learned to kind of strike that balance and be able to do that.
Excellent. And what was it that compelled you to become a documentary filmmaker? I mean, you started in '99, so you've almost
Yeah.
had 2 decades experience as being a filmmaker, and now you've won a number of different awards. And your documentaries, they are compelling and they are excellent.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. I love making documentary films. I wanted to be a fictional filmmaker. That takes a lot of money. You make one film a year, maybe 5 years. I'm a product of the digital revolution that came about towards the end of the '90s, with cameras became more consumer based, and it was more possible for you to buy a camera and make films. And so documentaries are just something that I sort of kind of stumbled on. I didn't think of making it into a career, but I really enjoyed the process. You don't know, where you're going to start your day. You never know where you're going to end it. You can be going to interview somebody, and then they say to you, you should really interview this person, and you should go over there, and you should go over here. And that comes about with almost every documentary that you work on, especially as an independent documentary filmmaker. And that lifestyle of being able to create and not exactly knowing where it's going to go, it's really exciting. And so I stumbled upon it, and then I've just made, I think I've made over 60 documentaries at this point, and I love it. I absolutely love it. It's you get to share experiences of people that otherwise people most likely wouldn't have gotten to be aware of. You get to meet. I've met thousands of people that I've interviewed all over the world. I've filmed in over 40 countries, and I don't think I would have been able to do that with any other sort of work or job out there. And so the adventures and the ability to tell stories and meet people from diverse different backgrounds is something that I'm really addicted to. Many say I'm a workaholic, that in the holics of drugs out there, this is my main addiction. And I'm quite happy with this addiction. It's a great addiction to have. Being able to share stories with the world and people is just wonderful.
So, considering that you have a passion and love for your native homeland, Israel, despite the fact that you spent a lot of time living in Canada, means you have a pretty unique perspective. You have the insider's perspective of growing up and living in Israel, being a Sabra, but also then being away from Israel and spending time living in Canada as well, which is one of the freest countries in the Western world. So, what is it about Israel that keeps drawing you back to her time after time after time, Igal?
So that's a brilliant question. I wish I knew. If I would know, I probably wouldn't come back here so much. I think that constant seeking, what is it about this country? First of all, a side note, Canada is an amazing country. We're part of the empire, somewhat. The Queen is on our loonie, so on our $1 coin, so it's all good. No, Canada is a wonderful country. I think living in Canada allowed me to really understand the importance of the state of Israel, and not just for the Jewish people. I really find this country, the state of Israel is a miracle. It's a miracle on many levels. It helps the world. It helps the world on so many fronts that people aren't aware of, and normally they're not being made aware of it, be it through health, be it through technology. Everybody, knows about tech and whatnot. The fact that we're able to communicate right now, there's an Israeli technology involved in this, maybe not in Zoom, but what brought, before Zoom, the predecessor. Israel really shares and helped make the world a better place, and I think it should be applauded for that. And so when I started making films, I noticed that it wasn't, and I noticed that people just wanted to defame it, just wanted to say what a horrible place it is, and some people were straightforward, straight out anti-Semites who just basically used the conflict to, they helped in the conflict to basically demonize Jews and the state of Israel. But then I also realized a lot of Jewish filmmakers started making a career for themselves by basically just looking at the bad, just looking at how can we shape the narrative to make Israel look evil. And there's a score of Israeli filmmakers who've made a long-standing career out of it. So I took a step back and I said to myself, well, I don't want to be a mouthpiece for the state of Israel because I don't want to be a propaganda filmmaker. What I want to do is really look at things objectively. And what I want to do is really see things and point out the gray zone. The problem with documentaries today is people just want to go. Documentaries are seen as no pun intended, as the word of God in many circles. I watched this documentary, I know so much about this topic. Well, you don't. You really saw what the director wanted you to see, the specific frames, et cetera, and it became this black and white world. I find that the strongest documentaries are the ones that point out the gray zone, where you're like, I'm not too sure what the director is really about. I'm not too sure where he or she stands. Maybe they are for this side. Oh wait, now they're going after this side. Maybe they're, and it confuses them. And then the director's point of view doesn't matter anymore. And all that's presented to you are, as nothing is objective. There's so much subjectivity, but presented a real reality from the existing reality that exists. And that gray zone is something that I'm always interested. So when it comes to circle back to the state of Israel, I find that a lot of filmmakers don't want to look at that gray zone. The majority of them just want to present, they want to, and this is the most cliche shot that I always refuse to shoot, right? They want to show a soldier at a checkpoint, or if they're going to talk about a settler, the settler always has to have a big kippah and a beard and tzitzit coming out and things along with an Uzi or whatever gun. It's cliche and people buy into it. If somebody from abroad comes to report in Israel and they go to the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, however you want to call it, give me a checkpoint, fill me a checkpoint, fill me a soldier not letting a car in or something like that. And it's really, it does a disservice. And more so, it continues this cycle of violence because it makes people think that this is the reality. The reality is far more complex, far more complex. And a lot of people also forget, and then we spoke about before we started, the fact of the matter is that this is the Middle East. This is a thriving democracy in a sea of tyrannical regimes that don't even think twice about gassing and killing their own people. 3 hours away from where I'm sitting right now, a man committed a genocide for 10 years, killed 600,000 people in Syria, and nobody batted an eye, and nobody cared. Within those 600,000, 20,000 of them, if not more, were Palestinian, and no one cared because Palestinian rights really don't matter, nor do any rights matter when it comes to the Middle East, to all these people who want to defame Israel. What matters is defaming and going after Israel, defaming and going after Jews. Israel is the biggest Jew, so let's do that. It's a tale as old as anti-Semitic time. It's just manifested itself in a different way this time around. And that's why, so circling back, that's why it's so important for me to share stories here where I show the reality. It's not always glossy, it's not always wonderful, but it's the reality. And when it comes to racism here from the Jewish majority, I think it should stop, and I think people should take the steps to embrace the Arab minority more so. But again, nothing lives in a vacuum. And within the Arab minority, there are many, unfortunately, the leadership constantly incites against the Israeli establishment, and it doesn't challenge. Challenge is completely legitimate. If you want to challenge, as a politician, you have a right to challenge the ruling party or the establishment. It doesn't challenge. It says things that if they were ever said in the parliamentary of Britain, that person would be expelled, right?
You'd like
But
to think so, though.
I don't know. Well, maybe, I don't know. Corbyn's still around, right? So who knows? But um, but they get away with it, and the problem is that then basically translates to the Israeli, and they say, "Oh, look at that leadership of the Arab population. That's all the Arabs," and when in fact it's not. It's an unfortunate representation, but it's not the majority of people who live here, who thrive here. You know, there are more people, there are more Arab minorities in post-secondary education in Israel, in Haifa University, even Bar Ilan University, which is a right-wing university, in Tel Aviv University, in Hebrew University, than there are per capita across the whole entire Middle East. You know, and yet people say apartheid, right? This apartheid being thrown around. People say, you know, they're not in the West Bank, so then they limit it to the West Bank. There are issues in the West Bank. There's no denying about that. But then they say there are only roads for Jews, which is completely untrue, and things along those lines. And so when I make a film, I look at the reality that exists, and I try to sort of, hopefully I succeed, to show the gray zone that exists, the complexity that exists here. If you watch one of my films and you're looking for a black and white kind of a message, good luck. You're not going to find it. You kind of get really upset watching it because I don't believe in black and white. We live in a world where there is no such thing as black and white. There's a lot of gray, and sometimes you find yourself on the left, and sometimes you're politically sticking, and sometimes you find yourself on the right. It's all issues, and this dogmatic way that we live, the many people want to just have a film serve it to them, just like take a position, is very propaganda. It's problematic for me, and smells of propaganda.
Should we have a look now at
Sure.
Igal's trailer for his film called My Home, that features Israeli Arabs looking into what it's like to live in Israel and to live in democratic Israel.
אני מאוד ציונית.
אני ערבי, בדואי, ישראלי.
לא כולנו נגד המדינה.
זה הבית שלי. אני צריך להגן על הבית שלי.
מה? وانا عنصرية انت تحسها مين؟
אמרתי לו, אבל ערבי זה לא כללה. אני ערבייה.
I encourage popular struggle.
وإذا تصير دم يعرفوا من اليوم إنه إحنا بهذا الموضوع مدنيين. اقتلوا مع نسيم! اقتلوا مع نسيم! نحن لا نستقيم نحن زاكين!
We are struggling for the self-determination of the Palestinian people.
Israel is really open and gives the free speech that it can't happen in the Arab countries around here.
טוב לכל אזרח ערבי שגר פה. ואני שמעתי את זה מאלפי אנשים שאומרים לך בערבית, אללה ידים על אל-אחתילאל. מה זה אללה ידים על אל-אחתילאל? שהשם ישמור את הכיבוש.
Igal, that was a trailer of your film that you made a few years ago, and it does incredibly well in kind of breaking down preconceived ideas that it's all about Israel and it's all about the Palestinians, and this horrendous narrative, which we know is not true, that Israel is oppressing the Palestinians, and that's the only narrative that our news outlets in Europe will actually show, including Britain as well. But thanks obviously to the COVID-19 situation and the vaccinations, we're seeing a different side of Israel in our news really for the first time. But can you share with us the ideas behind this film and showing Israel through the eyes of Israeli Arabs, both those that support the state of Israel, that are willing to serve in Israel's defense force, and also those Israeli Arabs that are using their positions of power and influence in order to incite against the Jewish state?
Right. So basically, I wanted to be fair, and like I said, but I didn't want to just choose the politicians. The problem is that a lot of people come and make films here. There's a Rolodex of people. Okay, call this person, and this person. And if you actually look at film, if you break down films from the Middle East, you'll always see almost the same person in every film. And so I didn't want to do that. I have Khanin Zouabi and Ahmed Tibi, who are politicians who are really well known. Zouabi isn't serving anymore, Tibi is. And I wanted to show their perspective because it's an important perspective. At the same time, I wanted to show a perspective that's never been really shown before of Muhammad Kabia, Jonathan Al-Khouli, and other people, Wafa Hussein, who's a teacher in the city of Tzfat. I'm not sure if she's there now, but she's doing extremely well in the education system, and really show their lives. Simply just show their lives and where they're coming from. And everybody has their different perspective, and everybody has, but the underlying theme for all of them, the connection is that they see Israel as a place of hope. They see Israel as a place where they can thrive. They don't see themselves as, they recognize the racism, and there's an amazing scene with Muhammad where we actually show, where we fortunately show how the racism unfolds in Israel, but they don't see just the racism. They see the good. They see how Israel benefits its the minorities that live within its borders, and they juxtapose it, as we all should, to the rest of the Middle East. Because people like to say, well, you can't do that because Israel's a democracy. You should juxtapose against some another thriving democracy. Well, the closest democracy to Israel is in Europe. I think Greece or Cyprus. I'm not too sure. I could be wrong about Cyprus, but it's very far away. I juxtapose it against those who share a border with Israel, and when you do that, you see that Israel is a thriving democratic state that constantly has to check itself and constantly has to find that line, that fine line, because what people also don't realize is that, as Prime Minister Ehud Barak said years ago, Israel is really a villa in a jungle. It is a jungle. And so sometimes, and I hope that doesn't come off as racist because it probably did, but the Middle East is a dangerous place. There are amazing people living here. The problem is that people are being ruled by tyrannical regimes, and so Israel has to constantly check itself and constantly find that balance where democracy and security are intertwined with one another. And that's something that no democracy in the 21st century has to deal with on the level that Israel does. Obviously, in the UK, you have terrorist attacks. What happened to the rule of law there, to the freedoms there, immediately after the attacks? 9/11 in the US and places like that enacted laws that some would consider very draconian. Israel never went as far as certain countries did when they were attacked. And Israel is constantly under the threat of attack, whether it's missiles from the south, whether it's terrorist attacks, stabbings, blowing up of buses and hotels. And so people forget that. And what I wanted to show is that the Arab minorities, at least that are featured in the film, are thinking about that. They realize that nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Everything happens for a reason. It doesn't justify it, but they learn to sort of change people's perspective by acknowledging what's happening and basically saying, well, we're not terrorists. We demand our rights. We deserve our rights. We're equal citizens here. But we're also for this country, and we're not going to incite and take on the Palestinian narrative as if that is our narrative, because that's also something foreign to them that's being pushed on them by whether it's left-leaning NGOs, European-funded governments that are funding all of these NGOs, or the Israeli left itself. Up until Oslo, Arab Israelis didn't really have this Palestinian ethos in their life. Once Oslo hits, the EU funding gets into this country, and all these NGOs suddenly, pop up everywhere. That ethos becomes a reality, and it's not. Ask the majority, and by the way, if anybody doesn't believe me, just Google this. There have been so many surveys about this. The majority of Arab Israelis, when asked whether you want to live in a future state of Palestine or the state of Israel, even in East Jerusalem, the majority of them have to say, absolutely, we want to live in the state of Israel, because they know what happens to Palestinians who are living under the PA, the Fatah control regime of Mahmoud Abbas, or the terrorist regime. I'm not sure there's a difference between them, but let's say there is, the terrorist regime of Hamas in Gaza. There is no freedom of press or expression in the West Bank, in PA-controlled cities in Ramallah. Ask yourself what happened to Christians in Bethlehem. I filmed a Christmas special in Bethlehem. Prior to Oslo, the majority of the city was Christian. Now, I think, 10, 12, 15%, even less, are Christian. This is when the PA took over. Israel left, the PA took over. For those 2 weeks in December, everybody's a Christian in Bethlehem, right? And then what happens to them? And so the notion that Israel is oppressing its minorities is a complete farce, it's a complete lie. Again, I'm not going to pretend it's wonderful. It's not. And the government should invest more in infrastructure, which it has, Netanyahu's government has over the years, but it should invest more in infrastructure, and it should invest more to incorporate, to bring and integrate the Arab minorities into various jobs and whatnot. And there's a long way to go, but it's far better than the entire Middle East, and I would even say many, many European countries as well.
So let's have a look now at an extract of this groundbreaking, award-winning documentary, My Home, that features some of the Israeli Arabs in this documentary.
אין לנו ארץ אחרת. אולי זה נדיר שערבי יגיד את זה, אבל אני אומר את זה ואין לנו ארץ אחרת. שוויון יש פה. אמת. וטוב לי, אני אומר את זה ובטוח מזה 1,000,000%. טוב, הוא לוקח את האחריות על זה. טוב לכל אזרח ערבי שגר פה. ואני שמעתי את זה מאלפי אנשים שאומרים לך בערבית, אללה ידים על אל-אחתילאל. מה זה אללה ידים על אל-אחתילאל? שהשם ישמור את הכיבוש.
אני חושבת שיש הרבה מה לעשות במגזר אצלנו. אנחנו צריכים להשתנות, להיות בטוחים יותר. אנחנו 67 שנים אזרחים במדינה הזאת. לא הגיע הזמן שנרגיש קצת שייכים?
Igal, it was only a few years ago I had the absolute pleasure of having Mohammed Kabir and Jonathan El-Khoury on the Middle East reports when I had a studio and I was able to record programs. And one thing that stood out about me with them in that interview was their absolute passion for Israel. Here we are, and including they also brought a Bedouin teenager along with them as well, who are essentially told this is not your role to go out into the world to talk about Israel, but they were so upset by the way that Israel has been demonized as an apartheid state that they wanted to show the world that Israel is not an apartheid state. They are Israeli Arabs who have found peace, sanctuary, and safety in Israel and are passionate about their country. And that was just so refreshing.
Right, and I mean they're remarkable. I bumped into Muhammad and Jonathan in Rome, and just so happened to be there at the same time years ago, and it was wonderful to see them. Muhammad now works with the Likud party. He has risen through the ranks. There was even a mention in just these past elections that he was going to get a seat in the Likud. He didn't. He works behind the scenes and he does amazing work. Jonathan, is still an advocate for the state of Israel. He's also an advocate for the South Lebanese army who used to fight along the state of Israel, and that they should get more rights within the state of Israel because they were allies, and I fully agree with them. And they are thriving in this country. And I think they're so passionate about it because they're sick and tired of all these lies that have been said about the state of Israel over the years. And to me, these people should be the representatives that go out there and speak in various, which they do in campuses, etc. And I want to see more of them. And I think the tragedy of the state of Israel up until, let's say, the last 5 years is that it didn't realize, and this is why I'm going to get critical of the state of Israel, it didn't realize that the best ambassadors that this country can ever have are Arab Israelis, because they will, not only will they destroy, they will prove that all of these lies are just that, they're lies. Their passion and the reality of what they experience will finally have people understand the complexity of living within this society. Again, not to sort of a bit repeat the same message, but it is a very complex country, and it is a country where not everything is perfect, but it's far better than so many other democracies that are out there. And I think more and more Arab Israelis are waking up to that fact. And I think what happened in Egypt and what happened in Syria especially made them aware of it. And that's another thing, Lebanon helped, Jordan helped, the rest of the world didn't help. The rest of the Arab world didn't help Syrian refugees, etc. You know which country did help Syrian refugees? The state of Israel. And they didn't care. It might have, whether it was an ISIS fighter or somebody, or Jordanian, they took care of everybody who came to that border injured. There were so many children that were flown in for special surgery, etc., during this whole civil war against Israel, civil war in Syria. And that's something that was almost never reported on. It was initially in the beginning, I think by CNN or maybe the BBC, I'm not sure. But throughout these 10 years of the genocide in Syria, because that's what it was a genocide perpetrated by Iran, Syria, and Russia. The state of Israel did its best, not to meddle, because it was, they couldn't, but they did their best to help whoever came to the border. Think about that. An enemy state, but it wasn't seen as that. The army took them in various hospitals, in Rambam Hospital, in the Sharet Tzedek in Sfat, I believe. These people were taken care of for months on end. The state flipped the bill. The state of Israel paid for their care. They didn't ask for a thank you. They didn't ask for anything. They just wanted to do what's right as human beings. And what's infuriating, really infuriating, is the fact that when it comes to, unfortunately, the UK and your publicly funded broadcast authority, the demonization that occurs almost constantly is unbelievable. And you got to ask yourself why. Why is it? Really, why is it when there's a genocide happening in China, when when various minorities and gays are being hanged in Iran, when there's a genocide happening in Syria, when there's a thriving slave trade across the Middle East, in Libya, Saudi Arabia, the one country that is constantly focused on and constantly demonized is the state of Israel. Even if you hate the state of Israel, take a step back and really ask yourself, why is it? And they're going to say, because we care about Palestinian rights. That's not true. You don't care about Palestinian rights. Because if you did, you'd care about their citizenships being stripped away in Jordan, the fact they've been in refugee camps for 70 years in Lebanon, not being allowed to go out to work even, their murder, killing them in Syria. You would actually care about those people's rights. But no, you just care about demonizing the state of Israel, because sadly, the people who do it, more so than none, I would say, are anti-Semites. Because Israel is the biggest Jew, so let's attack the biggest Jew. And it's really sad that it's gotten to a point where academia has been that, and to me it's tragic that so many Jewish organizations from the left have also decided to take part in this basically 21st century blood libel anti-Semitism. They just don't want to admit that it's that, because then they actually have to come to terms with what they're supporting.
And Igal, I have to ask you, in the documentary that you made, My Home, you feature some Israeli MKs, members of Knesset,
Oh yes.
that hold some very anti-Israel positions. Not
Yes.
only that, but they actually incite against the state of Israel, supporting the kind of extreme Palestinian narrative. And I'm pretty sure that I even saw a Hamas flag in one of the rallies.
So it's a Hamas flag. They incite. They call for jihad. Through blood and fire, we will release Jerusalem. I'm not sure what blood and fire means. I think in a normal world that is a call for murder. Shaheed, Shaheed, Shaheed.
Yep.
You know, etc. Jihad is
so.
etc.
I think the big question I want to ask,
Yeah.
that Israel is such a profound democracy. You can see that in Israel's parliamentary democracy, in the Knesset, how many different parties they are, different viewpoints, the freedom of the press there is in Israel.
Yeah.
And yet you could say maybe there's too much freedom. The fact is that here we are, Israeli Arabs that have got unprecedented freedom, unlike any other Arab across the entire Arab world. They incite against the state of Israel, and yet they're not arrested. The Israeli state doesn't curtail their voices, and they're allowed to incite, even in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament.
So
how and why?
So let's differentiate between the Arab MKs, the members of Knesset, members of parliament, and the regular individual on the street. So look, I mean, that's a democracy. Take it or leave it. Democracy isn't perfect. It allows every, you can bleep this word or just I won't say it, person to say whatever they want. And as much as it sometimes irks me, it upsets me, I'd much rather have that than the alternative. I'd much rather have that in the state of Israel than any of the other states around it, where, by the way, they would never be able to say anything like that. You know, anything along those lines of coming out against the state, they'd be arrested by the Mukhabarat and thrown in jail and never hear from them again.
Absolutely.
But no, that is the point of the state of Israel. It is a thriving democracy where members of Knesset, specifically these from the Joint List Party, more specifically Balad. Balad is the most fringe and the most extreme, but the rest of them are maybe a different shade of gray of extremism. Basically are allowed to say whatever they want, and they're allowed to compare Israel to a Nazi state, and they're allowed to scream apartheid, and they're allowed to do whatever they want because the law allows them to do so, because that is what happens in a democracy. Now, the problem with that, though, is that never gets covered. Here's what I notice. Even the Israeli media is also notorious for this. They constantly, especially Israeli filmmakers, you know, defending the state of Israel, as I said in the beginning, is a rite of passage here. But what happens is you never listen to them in Arabic. I'm not sure if it's just no budget to translate. I find that hard to believe, but you never actually listen to them in Arabic because they say something complete. When you actually listen to them in English, right? They're all about peace, and you know, they really want a one nation state, no borders, blah blah. But when you listen to them in Arabic, it is a completely different story. And that's the secret. Listen to them in Arabic, because when you do listen to them in Arabic, you will find that they incite. You will find that they praise jihad. You will find that they call for the blood to be running in the streets. Like we captured Jamal Zahalka, who is no longer in the Knesset, saying, and in fact, that was funny because that clip was used in Israeli TV contacted me. And they did a piece on him. And I guess they wanted to ambush him. He wasn't aware of the clip. And somebody made him aware of the film, and I got contacted. And I go, yes, you can use it if you're actually going to ask him about it, because you don't have the journalistic integrity to do that in the past. You didn't have it in the past. had to censor myself for a second there. And so they did, and he erupted and almost left the interview because he couldn't get away from it because the visual proof was there. Being Canadian afforded me the ability, because I'm a foreign crew, and they love foreign crews because normally foreign crews come there and just allow them to scream occupation, occupation, occupation without actually showcase, without actually pushing back. So being Canadian allowed me all this access, and I'm pretty sure they didn't think we're going to translate the entire 3-hour conversation and really go through it. And that's what we did. And when we did, you see it in the film, you actually see proof of this ongoing incitement. Zoabi is no longer in parliament, but somebody else is, and it's just as extreme. The leader of Balad, I forgot the gentleman's name, but the former leader of Balad, so he took it a step further. He now lives in some country in the Middle East. He escaped Israel because he could fly, because he had I forgot what the word is. When you're a parliamentarian, you can't be tried because you have
diplomatic immunity.
Yes, well, immunity. You have immunity. You can say whatever you want. You can do whatever you want, essentially, except for murder someone. And so he was being investigated for sharing information during the Lebanon War with Hezbollah. This man spied for Hezbollah. He was a member of the Israeli parliament. He was a leader of the Balad party, and he spied for Hezbollah. And I'm not going to say allegedly, because he was going to be charged and tried, and he escaped. He claimed it's a big conspiracy, etc., but it wasn't. He spied for Hezbollah, and there were other MKs. The problem is then the Jewish population sees this, and they think, well, this is all the Arabs, but it's not. It is a representation of the wish of the minorities to have things done internally to better their lives, roads, education, and things like that. So they choose their members of their community. If anybody knows anything about Israeli politics, it's very community-based. The religious have their communities, seculars have various parties, the settlers have their politicians, and the Arabs have their politicians. Except these people, instead of taking care of their people, right? Ahmed Tibi says it in the film. I ask him, what comes first on the hierarchy of what you care about? The Palestinian national identity is first. The people, the Arab Israelis' needs, the everyday needs of the roads and education and infrastructure, etc., that comes way, way after. So they do take care of it, but it's not a top priority, right? And that's slowly changing. You saw it in these elections with Ram, where the leader basically said, you know what? Let's forget the Palestinian narrative right now. All I care about right now is making the life of Israeli Arabs better. I want to get budgets. I want to get this. I'm going to work with the established government. And it doesn't mean that they're going to overnight be the biggest Zionists out there. But at least they can start integrating into society. And by integrating into society, the Jewish majority won't see them as a constant threat. And by integrating into society, the Arab minority will start even realizing more, and many of them have, that, wait a minute, maybe it's not Switzerland, even though in Switzerland, probably they won't be treated as nicely as they think they would, I assume. But it's definitely not Syria. It's definitely not the PA that where their nationalism is being forced upon us. What can we create here that's organic and allows us to thrive in this country and live in freedom and liberty and and thrive in this democracy? And so I think that's happening slowly. When I started making the film, I think it was really just starting to happen. And I realized that it was happening in the early 2010, 2011, something. I think I read an article, and then I started following a few people. And I think now it's even more advanced, and hopefully, in God willing, inshallah, in 10 years, it'll be a completely different situation where if, with all these elections that are happening in Israel, if the Jewish parties, the Israeli Jewish parties, realize that, hopefully they realize that they should allow for minorities, Christians, Muslims, Jews, to run in their parties in realistic, positions and get into parliament, because that will allow, I think, for this, when you have more moderates, for many Jews to not believe that all Arabs want to do is destroy them, which is farther completely not the case. Arab Israelis don't. The problem is that their politicians, not all, but the majority of the politicians that represent them, constantly want to demonize the state of Israel.
So let's see now the final extract from this excellent documentary, My Home, where we see Israeli Arabs that are very hostile to the state of Israel.
The Israeli court decided to destroy this village and to uproot its inhabitants.
هذا القرار لازم يكون موجود، وإذا بده يصير دم يصير دم. يعرفوا من اليوم إنه إحنا بهذا الموضوع مجانين. إحنا أبناء الشعب الفلسطيني بالنسبة لنا كنا نموت ولا ترحل. نكبة ثانية بالنقب لن تكون، يجب أن يفهموها هذه النقطة.
כל התפיסה של הדמוקרטיה היא יותר מורכבת. אין ספק שלגבי האוכלוסייה הערבית זה יותר ויותר קשה, כי יש פן לאומי גם.
احنا رايحين على القضيه حتى النهايه، حتى النهايه تماما 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 تماما، لانه هادم هذه القريه هي اهانه جماعيه واهانه شخصيه لكل شخص منهم. يعني وصلنا لوضع كسر. هذا الموضوع لا نستطيع ان نعيش معه ابدا ابدا.
It's a battle to win our life and our land. Something very crucial and very hostile is happening to us.
Igal, we only have 6 minutes left of this interview, so I want to bring very important points home. The first one is that this documentary, My Home, was aired on BBC Arabic across the Middle East. A number of different European and UK cinemas, as well as on Canadian television. Considering this was a unique perspective on Israel through the eyes of Israeli Arabs, how did it go down, and did it shape a different type of dialogue and discussion on Israel after it was aired?
So it all depends. It all depends on who watched it. I'm not too sure I know it aired across the Middle East, and so I hope it went well. I never really heard anything back. I can tell you during festivals, when it had a good festival run and it won a few awards, the hostility came from very left-leaning individuals who just couldn't take it. They were led to believe one thing for such a long time, and the biggest thing was in Vancouver, a Jewish member of, I don't know, some hateful Israeli group masquerading as a Jewish group, decided that I was lying. And I said, how am I lying? What am I lying about? Please tell me, because if I am lying, no problem. I'll apologize right now. I'll go and re-edit the film. Tell me what I'm lying about. You're making it seem as if I'm an educator. I taught a long time ago in Bar Ilan in university in Israel. There are no Arabs in university in Israel. They're not allowed to go in. That was just like, the Technion is 50% Arab, Tel Aviv University, etc. She's like, that's not true. I lost it. I used the F word, and I said, you bleep bleep lying. And I said to the audience, if you don't believe me, we can stop everything right now. Just take out your phone and Google this. Just Google And this is what happens when you start showcasing the truth to these people. They lose it because their house of cards, comes crumbling down because they've relied on so many lies for so many years that poking at it, even with the slightest truth, brings it all down. So that was very amusing, and it made people think, at least. And I heard, it had a good run on campuses across the U.S. and people responded extremely well to it. I got emails and messages on Facebook thanking me for making the film, and that it was very refreshing to see. And even people who didn't agree said it made them think in a different way, and it caused them to investigate more and to try to find out more. And that's great, because that's the best hope that's what you really hope for as a documentarian. We're not here to tell the whole subject matter. It's impossible to capture that, in this case, in 52 minutes. But at least it makes people think and makes them want to investigate more. And that's you can't hope for anything better than that.
So let's have a look at Igal's latest project, which is following the Israeli elections. As everyone knows, we've had 4 general elections in 2 years, so this has been a difficult project.
Give me some advice. This is my first time voting in an Israeli election. What should I be looking for?
Every election here is crucial.
The agenda is just not Netanyahu.
We call to unity government led by us, without Bibi Netanyahu.
I do think Netanyahu is one of the most important leaders that the state of Israel has ever had.
Is there a problem?
You have a television station that likes Netanyahu here, but most don't. You have a newspaper or two that likes Netanyahu, but most don't.
The political structure in Israel is tilting towards the right almost in any case.
I believe that the Israeli democracy is much stronger than this government.
This is how racism is infiltrating the Israeli political system. This affects Israel's democracy.
The left is deciding what the Israeli public has to think.
The Israeli public has to decide between trying to achieve peace and not trying to achieve peace.
I will do everything in my ability to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state.
The whole discourse that we've had is completely removed from reality, and it's about 10 degrees removed from any concept of democratic rule.
אנחנו עכשיו כוח עולמי עולה.
How confident are you about what's happening today and your campaign and your chances?
We'll win.
We're down to the last 3 minutes of the program, Igal, and I very much enjoyed interviewing you today. It's been very special and really informative. Can you share about your new documentary that is probably 3 years in the making, covering the Israeli elections, part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and even
part 5, who knows?
5, exactly. It doesn't feel like it's going to end. Now, Israeli democracy, and having filmed in the Israeli Knesset and Parliament, is incredibly special. Israelis are very vibrant. It's a very passionate, lively democracy. What was it like to actually film an actual Israeli election?
Crazy. I started off, it was supposed to be a 3-month project, and it was going to end the trilogy. I made a film 10 years ago called My Flag, My Home, My Election. Singular, not plural. And then it became this historic event, which has been completely crazy. I've flown through the pandemic 4 times to cover this. It's not fun doing a 12-hour flight with 2 masks on just so you can, cover this. And it's crazy, and it hasn't ended yet. The people here are very passionate. We follow Amir Ohana as he starts his career, and he's very powerful now in the state of Israel. He's one of our main characters. It's crazy and tragic at the same time. I think the people here deserve more from their politicians. It seems that the politicians, left or right, don't seem to care and set their ego aside. Netanyahu has a right to his day in court. at the same time, there's 9 million people here that have been living through 2 years of 4 elections without a proper budget, without a stable government in a region that's just looking for an excuse. And so, I don't know, Netanyahu is a great leader. He brought peace process with the Abraham Accords, the vaccinations, etc. On the flip side, there's all these charges against him. It's above my pay grade. But what I've done in the 2 years that I've been here, documenting all of these elections and the aftermath of each election, the protests, etc., and the COVID, is one of the hardest challenges. Again, with Lior Cohen and Gabriel Volkovic, 2 amazing camera people I've worked with, and especially Lior. It's been a challenge and almost heartbreaking, because you see there's so much infighting. There's so much. I don't know what's going to happen. It really does scare me in a way to see this democracy being in this constant tug of war between 2 sides that don't realize that if they don't come together, Jewish history has never been good to Jewish infighting. Every time Jews fight, we lose a temple, and this state is the embodiment of the third temple of being a thriving and amazing beacon light to the world. It's happening now. It's not something we need to wish for. This is the state of Israel. And I hope these politicians wake up before, it goes in a completely, in a way, bad way.
And Igal, finally, for our viewers watching this compelling interview that I'm doing with you today, how can they get hold of and how can they watch some of your superb documentaries? And I can't recommend your documentary, My Home, enough.
Well, thank you so much. So they can watch it on Chutzpah VOD. My company is called Chutzpah Productions, and we have a VOD channel on Vimeo. It's hopefully you'll have a Chiron thing at the bottom there with the link, and they can just press on the link and download the movie, help your independent filmmaker a little bit out with a few pounds. Pounds are much better than the Canadian dollars, so I'll take pounds, but I'll take any thing. And they can watch, I think I have about 13 or 14 films up there that I've made in the last 10 years, a few more coming. And hopefully they can watch them and enjoy them.
And Igal, I've really enjoyed interviewing today, and I'm sure our viewers will as well. So keep up the excellent work you're doing. Very much looking forward to seeing your new documentary about the Israeli elections when it comes out. And I just want to wish you every success with these groundbreaking documentaries. So thank you for joining me today. And I just want to thank you for watching this program today, this home edition of the Middle East Report, with my interview with Igal. And what we see really from his filmmaking expertise is we get to see a different perspective on Israel, and a vital perspective being told by Israeli Arabs of how they view Israel, which is really the real Israel, not the one portrayed by our mainstream media. So it's an imperative that we do what we can to support the Israeli Arabs who stand with Israel and stand with the Jewish people. So thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report.